Chapter 3. Morning came far too early. There was no general wake-up call that Dahiel could discern. Instead, he woke to the sounds of the squad getting ready for the day. One of the girls shrieked playfully as her friend splashed water from a basin at her. Most of the kids were already up and yelling insults at each other as they scrubbed their faces and exposed skin. As Dahiel propped himself up on his elbow to watch, 3 of the boys dumped a full basin of water on one of the boys still in bed. His enraged shouts woke the other stragglers, and they hopped out of bed with enough energy and speed that Dahiel had no question that this was a normal routine. "Time to get up, Lazy Smith." "Ah, Tallulah, she's so polite to our newcomer." "Shut up, dipshit. We have 5 minutes to get to morning exercises. You better be clean by the time we get there, or Sergeant Smith is going to tan your hide." That is exactly how he phrases it, and personally, I believe him. He's a mean little shit. Dahiel was out of bed by the time the girl had spoken 5 words. He splashed water on his face, but it did nothing to clear what felt like the dust of 1,000 worlds from his mind. He was exhausted. He hadn't slept well. Dreams of blood and running had left him shaky and weak. He stripped his shirt off quickly, mimicking the boys around him and scrubbing as much of his exposed skin as he could reach with the rough rags and harsh soap sitting among the basins. He was still pulling his shirt back on over his head as he trailed the line of students out into the quiet order of the hall. Sergeant Smith was exactly as Tallulah had described, maybe 5 feet tall in boots, with around 20 feet of furious voice. He screamed his fury at how untidy they were, how late, and how pathetic before setting them to running laps around the walled aisle that ringed the entire complex. At first it looked as though the man had not noticed that he had a new student, until they started running and the general belligerence focused on Dahiel. No matter how fast he ran, the voice was right behind him, telling him he was too slow, he wasn't trying hard enough, or he was trying too hard, until he was running fast enough that the sergeant couldn't both keep up and shout at the same time. Tallulah shot him a glance as he pulled in front of her, but Dahiel was already past coherent thought. He had too many memories of running for his life, running for Maren's, and always being chased. Fear pushed him past the point of pleasant exercise and into the land of pain, but he couldn't stop. It wasn't until the others had all slowed to a walk that Dahiel was able to force himself to stop at all. He let the walkers pass him before he started moving again. His legs were twitching and burning, and his heart would not slow down. For a moment he did not even notice the odd looks that the others gave him as they passed. The sergeant did not yell at him as the squad lined back up, though Tallulah managed to find a moment in the bustle to brush past him and mumble, "Pace yourself, teacher's pet." Dahiel wasn't the only one panting, but he was willing to bet he was the only one with fear pounding in his heart as he lined up. Just down the line, Tallulah was watching him, but the sergeant was yelling again. He started them on a series of simple but repetitive exercises, and Dahiel fought to force his muscles to continue. Luckily, he had endless experience with just that. When the sergeant was down near the far end of the line, shouting about sloppy form, Tallulah tapped the boy next to her on the arm, and they switched position without losing a step in the lunges. One more switch, and she was right next to Dahiel. "You all right, Smith?" He nodded, saving his breath for the lunges. The simple exercises were followed by complex and vaguely martial forms. He made it through the rest without drawing any more than the bare minimum of the sergeant's ire, but it hurt. When the sergeant finally yelled his dismissal, Dahiel almost collapsed, leaning over with his hands braced against his knees. "I'm impressed, New Smith. Most newbies fall down well before the end of their first run. Not to mention all the exercises." Dahiel fought to contain his groan. He could have hedged it, pretended like he couldn't go any further. Tallulah was still looking at him oddly. "Come on, it's not time for bed yet." She pulled him upright, and after the string of students streaming away from the exercise yard. "You going to be all right, Smith?" Dahiel really wished she hadn't mentioned bed. "Yes." "You going to tell me what happened back there?" In the shuffling line, her voice was easily quiet enough to go unnoticed. "I got carried away." "You got petrified." She snorted and glanced back towards him. "Anything I should know about?" Dahiel just kept walking, hoping she would take the hint. She did not. "I don't want you bringing anything into my squad." "Your squad?" "Yes, Smith, my squad. I lead these dipshits." I didn't realize there was a squad leader. Not officially, but leaders don't get assigned until we graduate, but no one's argued yet. And you are changing the subject. He was saved from answering by their arrival at the dining hall. They were some of the last few to come in, and Dahiel barely had time to glance around to find Maren in the crowd before they were sitting. Pay attention to your food, not your sister, Smith. After a silent and speedy breakfast, Dahiel had another session of quizzing, this one on simple mathematics. He carefully got every third question wrong, few enough that he didn't seem like he was trying to fail, but enough to seem broadly uneducated. The rest of the class was almost enjoyable. The lessons were simple, and Dahiel easily followed along. Math made way to strategic logic, which he felt safe enough to do all right in. The highlight of the extremely quick lunch was Dahiel finding a spot he could sit and still keep a distracted eye on Maren. She seemed to be doing all right, even smiling and waving when she noticed him looking her way. After lunch, most of the squad headed one direction, while a few split off to head the other. Dahiel stood awkwardly by the table until Tallulah waved for him to follow her. Come on, Smith. Let's see what you're made of. According to the schedule that the corporal had given him, it was time for either training or chores. Dahiel knew that he would have to have his skill level tested, and he was uncomfortably aware that it would have something to do with fighting. Tallulah led him to an empty yard where the same Sergeant Smith from the morning was waiting. Daniel Smith, front and center. He stepped forward hesitantly. Even ignoring the complex question of what kind of skills and what proficiency he would be expected to have, Dahiel felt like he was stepping out onto a tightrope. He was not a fighter, but the Guardian was, and he certainly did not want to awaken that right now. He was all right for a while, awkwardly mimicking the forms that Sergeant Smith had Tallulah demonstrate, but as soon as the word sparring left the sergeant's mouth, Dahiel's chest tightened. The sergeant waved Tallulah over to face him, but she had already been stepping forward before the man had raised his hand. She knew she would be the one summoned, and that worried Dahiel. Tallulah was clearly not the average student. The others stepped back, forming a circle around the combatants, and watched with blank faces. Only Tallulah grinned at him. He wished he could take the comfort she offered, but it was clear that she meant to tell him that she would not hurt him too badly, and that was far from what had him worried. Tallulah nodded, and the sergeant called, "Go." She did not wait for Dahiel to try anything, which was probably wise, considering he had no intention of even throwing a single punch at the girl. She moved forward quickly, kicking her leg out to hook his ankle. She obviously intended to take him down quickly, without too much work or embarrassment. He responded without meaning to, lifting his foot out of the way. He stumbled back, drawn off balance by his own movement. Tallulah did not take the time to be surprised. She pushed forward again, this time shoving his shoulder. Even already off balance, he twisted with the shove, letting the momentum carry him back upright and leaving nothing for the girl to push off against. But Tallulah was too skilled to stumble. She stepped back, reassessing her sparring partner. Dahiel swallowed a lump in his throat. He hated this. He hated the eyes on him. He hated knowing that he was inevitably going to take a misstep. Tallulah rushed him again, throwing her shoulder at his gut. At the last second, he stepped aside with his foot still in place, catching her foot as she passed. She stumbled, but did not fall. But she was embarrassed. He shouldn't have been able to dodge her so completely each time. This time, when she went for him, she wasn't trying to make it easy. She threw a punch, aimed at his chest, and Dahiel brushed it away with the soft part of his forearm. It would be better if he would just let Tallulah throw him, lose the fight, and get this over with before anything bad happened. But he was already past that. He palmed another punch out of the way and bit his lip against the desire to hit back. Tallulah was getting serious. Blows were coming quicker now, and it was no longer just a matter of sidestepping and brushing her aside. Dahiel found himself falling back to a defensive stance. He blocked another punch and responded. His fist stopped inches from Tallulah's face. He swallowed nausea and just barely ducked under the kick she aimed his way. He broke away, trying to get distance, but Tallulah followed. They were both dripping with sweat before a punch finally connected. She was a hell of a lot stronger than she looked, but Dahiel took the blow to his gut without even slowing. He pushed off her shoulders, then used the distance to drive his heel into her hips. He managed to pull the blow at the last second, only sending her stumbling backwards rather than snapping the joint. He hoped desperately the sergeant would have seen what he needed already and put an end to this, but when he glanced over, the man was still watching impassively. Dahiel paid for his inattention with a kick in the side. It was powerful enough to slide him a few feet, though he managed to keep his feet under him. He drew his hands back and felt guardian power gathering before he had even a moment to think. He realized what he was doing and dropped his arm, swallowing hard against the bile rising in his throat. Tallulah did not have the same handicaps. Her next punch would have decked him, but he barely brushed under it, instead coming up into the knee she had aimed at his gut. Dahiel grunted and struck back. His crossed wrist caught under her elbow in an upward thrust, which drove her own guarding fist into her face. "All right, I've seen enough." The sergeant's voice was loud enough to break through the buzz in Dahiel's ears. He pushed away, getting a good 10 feet of clearance from the girl. Her nose was bleeding, but she didn't look angry. He didn't know what she looked like, except maybe interested? The sergeant was shouting at Tallulah, mostly corrective advice about her fighting technique, but when he turned to Dahiel, he just nodded. "Swords." He waved imperiously, and one of the boys rushed up with the weapons. Dahiel held his breath, but when the blade was passed over to him, he realized it was wooden. The practice weapon felt unwieldy and heavy. When he looked back up, Tallulah was already back in line. Dahiel was alone in the circle with the sergeant. She grinned over at him as she pinched her nose, trying to staunch the bleeding. He knew she meant the grin to be reassuring, but the sight of blood did not help. The second match was easier. The weapon helped. It was so unfamiliar in his hands that it brought up none of the emotional, visceral reactions. He concentrated on the unfamiliarity, and it was over quickly. Within moments, the sergeant's wooden sword was at his throat, scraping the skin hard enough to draw a light, bloody line across his neck. The testing of Dahiel's skills took over half of the training time. When it was finally over, the sergeant put him back in line with barely a word and started the entire group practicing kicks and punches. Dahiel tried his best to ignore the odd glances that the other students were shooting him. Even Tallulah kept glancing his direction with an unreadable expression on her face. He had done too well. He should have held back. In the break between rounds of kicks, he let his head drop down, rubbing his forehead as if he could rub the regret away. He paid for his lapse. The sergeant saw and set him to running laps. He was not good at this. God must have heard his prayers. The training time ended before the sergeant could call them to more sparring. Dahiel had never been quite so happy to be heading to a classroom, but as the first of their squad turned the last corner, Tallulah caught his arm. She held him back and pulled him unresisting into a side hall. "You going to be okay, Smith?" No. There was no way he was going to be able to do this day after day. He had barely made it through one session. But not doing so would destroy any chance Maren had at safety here. He couldn't pull her out of this world just because he was uncomfortable. Hell, he literally couldn't. He had no idea how the portals opened, but he knew it was nothing he controlled. And escaping from this camp where he was watched day and night seemed almost as impossible. Even if he could get the star out of here, nothing he had heard since arriving here gave him any misconception that he would be able to keep them out of the army's hands. What it boiled down to was that anything he tried would put Maren in danger. "I'll be fine." "Bullshit, Smith! You're a fucking horrible liar." Her dark brown eyes searched his, but when he kept his expression blank, she snorted. "Straighten your clothes. We're going to be late." Class was more math than logic. Dahiel happily distracted himself with taking endless notes, which he carefully tucked away in his pockets. He wanted bed so badly his exhaustion was a physical ache, but he stayed upright and aware because it was what he had to do. When his squad arrived at the dining hall, Dahiel barely took the time to find Maren in the crowd before sitting heavily. The rest of the squad was still standing. He started to force his weight back onto his feet, but everyone else sat down before he could. He stared into the empty plate in front of him, and when the platters of food passed to him, he handed them on without taking anything. Then he looked down, and his plate was full. Tallulah wasn't even looking at him as she piled another heaping spoonful of something green on his plate. So Dahiel tried to eat, but he barely managed to bring the fork to his mouth once before he let his hand drop by his side. He was so tired he was nauseous. When it became obvious he wasn't going to eat, Tallulah took the plate and divvied up what was on it between her and the boys around him. We're punished for waste, she explained under her breath. He would have felt guilty if they hadn't seemed so happy to devour the extra. Dahiel sat through the rest of dinner silently, only turning a couple of times to check on Maren before the squad stood and shuffled off to their barracks. Staring at her isn't going to make her any safer, Smith. Tallulah turned to him the second the door to their barracks shut behind them. What? Dahiel had been aiming at his bed, but with Tallulah right in front of him, he couldn't. Instead, he let the girl steer him towards the same table she had claimed the previous night. The kids that had been sitting there vacated their spots without even a sign of annoyance. Your sister. She's fine. She'll be safe for now. Then where are all the girls? Tallulah was one of the only 3 girls in their squad, and judging from the dining hall, theirs was not the exception. There seemed to be plenty of young girls, but as soon as the age of the squads increased, the number of girls decreased. It was a serious risk asking the question. He didn't know whether this was the sort of thing he was supposed to already know, but if he didn't take risks, he was never going to learn anything. Tallulah carefully did not look around. Astute, Smith. Girls don't make very good soldiers. There was an unpleasant sarcasm to her voice. Girls are better suited to organizational work and marrying war heroes. But don't worry. There are a hell of a lot less war heroes when we aren't at war. Dahiel absorbed her words, not commenting on the fact that since he had arrived, he had heard almost nothing but speculation about the upcoming war. But he didn't have long to dwell on how dangerous being separated from Maren would be. With some subtle sign, Tallulah had summoned over some of the boys from the night before. Dahiel stood, heading towards bed, but one of the boys grabbed him by the wrist and dragged him back to the table. Where are you headed, Danny boy? Come play some cards. It took a moment for Dahiel to remember he had been introduced as Daniel. Danny would be a variation of Daniel. He looked at Tallulah, but she just grinned at him. Hell no, Smith. I kept them at bay last night. Tonight you're going to have to face the Moranic fucknubble squad on your own. Do you play spotter? Dahiel still couldn't remember the names of any of the boys crowding around the table. All he knew was that the tall boy, Tobias, was not there. No, I'm afraid not. We'll teach you, come on. He lost 3 rounds in a row before they finally let him go to bed, even then shouting that he would have to play again tomorrow night to win back all the imaginary money he had lost. He fell into bed thinking about how he should change into his nightshirt, but he couldn't seem to convince his limbs to move. He had been drifting in and out of consciousness on waves of chatter for almost an hour when something caught his attention. The room was dark behind his closed eyes, but there was still a low-level buzz of conversation that promised a number of people were awake. Voices shifted oddly in the darkness, but Tallulah's voice caught his attention. She was still at her table, with Tobias and a couple of the other boys. They should have been well out of the audible range, but Dahiel was a very good listener. Michael will want to know. I'll tell him in the 3rd quarter. Have you mentioned Newsmith to him? That voice was one of the boys Dahiel had been playing cards with. Adam, maybe? Not yet. Why not, Tallulah? No real reason. But what is he? Definitely Tobias. Dahiel recognized the suspicious tones in his voice. Who says he's anything more than what he seems? He's just another orphan dragged to the camp. Walked to the camp, Adam. No one just walks to the camp. I did, Tobias. Tallulah's voice was heavy with meaning Dahiel did not understand. Yeah, but Tallulah, his story doesn't make sense unless he's either a spy or a wild one, and you said... Tallulah's voice interrupted, too low to be discernible, and Dahiel fell asleep before the volume of the conversation rose back to a level he could understand.